Bullets don't care about your bank account, yet some men still try to buy their way out of dying. Damien Costa laid on the operating table, his chest torn open by rival lead, yet his lips curled into a cruel, dismissive sneer. He looked at the woman frantically trying to pack his wounds and laughed, calling her a worthless, glorified maid who couldn't stomach real power. He was about to learn that true power doesn't hold a gun, it holds the scalpel. The Hawthorne estate sat heavily amidst the dense, rain-battered forests of upstate New York, masquerading as a secluded sanctuary for the ultra-wealthy. In reality, it was a ghost clinic, a highly classified, multi-million-dollar subterranean trauma center, designed specifically for men whose injuries could not be reported to the authorities. It was a place where the underworld came to cheat death, buying silence and survival with briefcases full of unmarked bills. Tonight, the clinic's heavy steel-reinforced doors were blown violently open, not by the storm raging outside, but by the frantic, chaotic arrival of the Costa Syndicate. "Get a damn doctor out here right now. If he stops breathing, I'll paint this lobby with every single one of your brains." The voice roared over the crashing thunder. It belonged to Vincenzo Gallo, the volatile underboss of the Costa family, whose bespoke suit was drenched in rainwater and a horrifying amount of blood. He was helping carry a stretcher, flanked by 4 heavily armed enforcers. On the stretcher lay Damien Costa. At 34, Damien was the undisputed king of the eastern seaboard's illegal shipping lanes. He was a man who traded in fear, a ruthless architect of crime who had clawed his way to the top over the bodies of his rivals. Even now, with 3 bullets lodged in his torso and his life leaking out onto the pristine white tiles of the clinic floor, Damien radiated a terrifying dark charisma. Juliet Lawson did not flinch at the shouting. As the lead private trauma nurse at Hawthorne, she had seen her fair share of monsters bleed. She was a former combat medic who had spent 2 tours piecing together shattered soldiers in the desert, before realizing the private sector paid astronomically better for her unique ability to remain dead calm under immense pressure. "Back away," Juliet ordered, her voice cutting through the panic like a whip. She stepped into the center of the trauma bay, snapping on her sterile latex gloves. "If you want him to live, get out of my light and put the guns away." "Now," Vincenzo sneered, taking a step toward her, his hand twitching toward the heavy pistol at his waist. "Listen to me, you little—" "Do what she says, Vinny," a gravelly, wet voice interrupted. Damien lifted his head slightly from the gurney. His face was a ghastly shade of pale, the kind of translucent gray that preceded complete circulatory collapse. Yet his dark eyes were sharp, burning with an unyielding, arrogant fire. He coughed, a terrible rattling sound that sprayed a fine mist of crimson over his chin. Juliet immediately moved to his side, shining a penlight into his pupils before grabbing a pair of heavy trauma shears. "I need to expose the wounds," she said mechanically, moving to cut the fabric of his ruined shirt. Damien's hand shot out, his grip surprisingly like a vice, as his bloody fingers wrapped around her wrist. "Careful, sweetheart," he rasped, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "This shirt costs more than you make in a year. I'd hate for you to have to work off the debt." Juliet stared down at him, her expression an impenetrable mask of absolute indifference. She effortlessly twisted her wrist, breaking his weakened grip, and drove the shears through the thick, blood-soaked silk, slicing it entirely in half. "Your money is irrelevant if you're dead, Mr. Costa, and right now you are bleeding out from a perforated abdomen." Damien let out a harsh, breathless laugh that ended in a grimace of agony. He watched her as she began to rapidly pack the entrance wounds with hemostatic gauze, applying brutal, necessary pressure that made the monitors around them blare in protest. "Look at you," Damien mocked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for her. acting like you own the room. You think because you have a pair of scissors and a shiny badge you're in charge." He gritted his teeth as she inserted an IV line into the crook of his arm with practiced, ruthless efficiency. "You're just a glorified maid, a bedpan pusher. You clean up the messes for the men who actually run the world. Don't mistake your little utility belt for actual power, honey. You're a wage slave wiping blood off the floor of a basement." Dr. Harrison Miles, the clinic's lead surgeon, rushed into the room, his face slick with nervous sweat. He took one look at the monitors and the notorious Mafia boss on the table and visibly swallowed hard. "Pressure is tanking," Dr. Miles stammered, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for a gown. "We need him in OR1 immediately. Prep the anesthesia." Juliet ignored the doctor's panic, keeping her steady hands pressed firmly against Damien's ruined abdomen. She leaned down, her face inches from Damien's, close enough to smell the metallic tang of his blood and the expensive cologne clinging to his skin. "You're going to go to sleep now, Mr. Costa," Juliet said, a voice entirely devoid of the subservience he expected. It was cold, clinical, and steady. "When you wake up, I suggest you remember who spent the night keeping your heart beating while your men stood around screaming." "I pay you to keep my heart beating," Damien spat back, his eyelids growing heavy as the propofol began to course through his veins. "You're just the help. Remember that, if I die. Vinny will skin you alive." "Count backward from 10, Juliet replied flatly, watching as his arrogant eyes finally rolled back, the darkness of anesthesia dragging him under. As his muscles went slack and the monitors shifted to a steady, rhythmic beep, Juliet looked at Dr. Miles. "He's under. Let's get these bullets out before his ego kills him." The operating room was a fortress of blinding white light and humming machinery. For 2 agonizing hours, Juliet and Dr. Miles fought a desperate war against Damien Costa's failing anatomy. The damage was catastrophic. One bullet had shattered his lower ribs, sending bone fragments deep into the surrounding tissue. Another had torn through his left flank, dangerously close to his descending aorta. Dr. Miles was a brilliant surgeon on paper, but beneath the suffocating pressure of the Mafia enforcers waiting just down the hall, his nerves were beginning to fray. "Suction, damn it, more suction, Doctor," Miles hissed, his hands trembling as a sudden geyser of dark venous blood erupted from the abdominal cavity. "I can't see the bleeder. He's losing too much volume. Where is that second unit of O negative? Hanging it now," Juliet said, moving swiftly to the IV pole. She grabbed the blood bag that had been rushed in by one of the clinic's junior orderlies just moments before. As she went to spike the bag, her trained eyes caught a minute, almost imperceptible detail. The barcode on the blood bag was slightly misaligned, and the expiration date stamp looked smudged, a stark deviation from the Hawthorne Clinic's obsessive militant standards. Juliet paused. She looked closer at the bottom of the bag, noticing a tiny puncture mark near the port, sealed with a microscopic dab of clear adhesive. The blood had been spiked. Her mind raced. Someone had intentionally tampered with the blood supply meant for Damien Costa, and there was only one person out there who had the authority to bypass the clinic's security, to hand off supplies to an orderly. Vincenzo Gallo, Finny. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a rival gang shootout. This was an internal coup. Vinny had orchestrated the hit, and when Damien had somehow survived, Vinny brought him here not to be saved, but to ensure he died on the table where it would look like a surgical failure. "Lawson, the blood." "He's crashing, Doctor," Miles screamed, staring in horror as the heart monitor began to emit a frantic, high-pitched alarm. "Ventricular tachycardia. Damien's heart was beating too fast to pump blood, spiraling rapidly toward a complete stop. "That bag is compromised," Juliet stated, tossing the tainted blood onto a stainless steel tray. She sprinted toward the secure pharmaceutical fridge in the corner of the room, punching in her access code to retrieve a fresh, untampered unit of whole blood. "What are you doing?" "Dr. Robber," Miles demanded, his eyes wide behind his surgical mask. "We don't have time for this." Before Juliet could explain, the blinding surgical lights flickered violently. A loud, deep mechanical groan echoed through the subterranean walls of the clinic, followed by a total suffocating darkness. The power had been cut. 3 seconds later, the dim red emergency backup lights flickered on, casting the operating room in a sinister, bloody glow. The life support machines switched to their internal batteries, their alarms now a chorus of mechanical panic. Then came the sound that made Dr. Miles freeze entirely. Gunfire. It was muffled by the heavy doors, but unmistakable. The sharp, rapid cracks of suppressed automatic weapons echoing down the hallway. Shouts, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. Vinny was cleaning house, ensuring no witnesses remained. "Oh my God," Dr. Miles whispered, dropping his surgical instruments into the open wound. He ripped off his bloody gloves, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "They're killing everyone. We have to get out of here. We have to hide." "Doctor, get back here," Juliet snapped, furiously spiking the clean blood bag and squeezing it to force the fluid into Damien's collapsing veins. "His aorta is still clamped. You have to close the artery." "He's a dead man anyway," Miles shouted hysterically, backing away from the table. "I'm not dying for Mafia scum." Without another word, the surgeon turned and bolted for the secondary exit leading to the staff locker rooms. Juliet watched him run, a surge of adrenaline sharpening her senses to a razor's edge. She was left entirely alone in the red-lit room with a man who was moments away from cardiac arrest, a man who had belittled her, mocked her, and treated her like dirt beneath his expensive shoes. She could leave him. It would be so easy. She could walk away, slip out through the underground ventilation maintenance shafts, and let Vincenzo Gallo inherit the underworld. Damien Costa would simply bleed out in the dark, a fitting, pathetic end for a man built of pure arrogance. Juliet looked down at Damien's pale, unconscious face. The sneer was gone, replaced by the profound, slack vulnerability of a man teetering on the edge of the abyss. "You're just a glorified maid. You clean up the messes for the men who actually run the world." "Ha!" His words echoed in her mind. Juliet's jaw tightened. "I'm a nurse," she muttered to the empty room. "And I don't lose patience on my table." Moving with terrifying precision, Juliet stepped into the surgeon's position. She grabbed a pair of DeBakey forceps and heavy silk sutures. She wasn't a surgeon, but she had assisted in enough combat trauma procedures to know exactly what needed to be done to buy him time. She located the torn vessel, her fingers slick with his blood, and tied off the bleeder with rapid, tight knots. The heavy thud of boots approached the main OR doors. Someone was trying the electronic lock, finding it dead due to the power outage. "Blow the lock," a muffled voice yelled from the hallway. Juliet grabbed heavy trauma pads and frantically packed Damien's open abdomen, ignoring standard protocols. She grabbed a surgical stapler and aggressively stapled his skin together, a brutal, ugly, but effective temporary closure. She unlocked the wheels of the heavy surgical table. It was designed to double as a transport gurney in emergencies. With a grunt of sheer physical exertion, she shoved the heavy table toward the hidden disposal elevator, a discreet, manually operated lift used to move deceased VIPs out of the clinic without causing panic. Boom! The electronic lock on the main doors shattered. As heavy boots kicked the doors open, Juliet had shoved Damien's gurney into the dark shaft of the disposal elevator, stepping in after him and pulling the heavy metal grate shut. She yanked the manual release lever just as flashlight beams cut through the red haze of the operating room. The elevator plummeted downward into the pitch-black depths of the estate's lowest, forgotten sub-basement, carrying the dying Mafia king and the woman who held his life in her blood-stained hands. Consciousness did not return to Damien Costa gracefully. It clawed its way back through a heavy, suffocating fog of agony and chemical suppression. The first thing he registered was pain, a blinding, white-hot inferno radiating from his core, as if his very organs had been replaced with broken glass and lit on fire. The second thing he registered was that he could not scream. Panic, primal and terrifying, surged through his mind. He tried to open his mouth, tried to thrash, but his limbs felt like they were made of wet concrete. They refused to obey. He gagged, a sharp mechanical obstruction wedged deeply down his throat. It was an endotracheal tube, forcing air in and out of his lungs with a rhythmic, synthetic hiss-click. Damien forced his eyes open. He expected the blinding white lights of the Hawthorne operating room, the nervous, sweating face of Dr. Miles, and the comforting presence of Vincenzo and his armed guards. Instead, he saw a crumbling, water-stained concrete ceiling. A single, naked, incandescent bulb hung from a frayed wire, casting a weak, jaundiced yellow light across a small, claustrophobic room. The air was frigid and smelled of mildew, old dust, and the sharp tang of iodine. He was lying on a rusted military-issue cot. A rudimentary IV pole stood beside him, fashioned from a bent metal pipe, holding a bag of saline and a bag of dark red blood. The ventilator breathing for him was a bulky analog machine that looked like it belonged in a museum, its bellows pumping with a wheezing, desperate sound. Damien tried to turn his head. The effort was monumental, sending fresh waves of nausea and fire through his abdomen. When his vision finally stabilized, he saw her. Juliet Lawson was sitting in a faded, torn armchair just a few feet away. She was no longer wearing her pristine scrubs. She wore a dark turtleneck and cargo pants, her hands clean, her posture relaxed. She was casually reading a worn paperback book by the dim light, looking utterly out of place in the grim, dungeon-like surroundings. Sensing his movement, Juliet looked up. Her eyes met his, and for a long moment she simply stared at him. There was no pity in her gaze. There was no fear. There was only a profound, unshakable calm. She closed her book, set it on a nearby crate, and stood up, walking slowly toward the cot. Damien tried to speak, but the tube in his throat only allowed a pathetic, choking gurgle. His heart rate spiked on the small portable monitor resting on the floor. "Don't fight the tube, Mr. Costa," Juliet said quietly. "Your diaphragm is partially paralyzed from the residual anesthetics in the trauma. If you panic, you will suffocate. Nod if you understand." Damien glared at her, his eyes wide with confusion, rage, and a rapidly growing sense of terror. He forced his head into a jerky, agonizing nod. "Good," she said, pulling a small penlight from her pocket and shining it briefly into his eyes. "You're in a decommissioned fallout shelter roughly 50 feet below the main foundation of the Hawthorne estate. It hasn't been used since the Cold War." Damien's brow furrowed. "Why? Where are my men? Where is Vinny?" He tried to convey the questions with his eyes, thrashing his right hand weakly against the side of the cot. Juliet watched his pathetic struggle. She leaned against the cold concrete wall, crossing her arms over her chest. "You want to know where your empire is?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. Damien nodded frantically. "Your empire is gone," Juliet stated, delivering the words with the clinical detachment of a doctor pronouncing a time of death. "Your loyal underboss Vincenzo tampered with your blood supply during surgery. When that failed to kill you fast enough, he cut the power and ordered his men to execute everyone in the surgical wing. He bought your men, he bought the clinic. He wanted you dead on the table. Damien's eyes widened, the monitor beside him blaring a sudden, frantic warning as his heart rate skyrocketed. Binny betrayed me. The realization hit him harder than the bullets had. Dr. Miles ran, Juliet continued, ignoring the beeping monitor. He was shot in the back 3 times before he reached the stairwell. You were bleeding to death, your chest cavity was open, and the men you paid to protect you were actively blowing the locks off the doors to finish the job. She took a step closer, towering over his paralyzed, broken form. The shadows cast by the swinging bulb made her look haunting, almost spectral. "You told me that I was just a glorified maid," Juliet said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly even whisper. "You said I clean up messes for the men who run the world. You said true power doesn't hold scissors." Damien stared up at her. For the first time in his entire life, the ruthless Mafia king felt utterly, completely powerless. He was strapped to a rusted bed in a buried tomb, relying on a machine to breathe, betrayed by his closest friend, stripped of his wealth, his men, and his dignity. Juliet reached down and rested her cool hand gently on the side of his face. The touch was entirely devoid of comfort. It was a brutal assertion of absolute control. "Look around you, Damien," she whispered. "Where are the men who run the world now? They left you to rot. Your money means nothing down here. Your threats mean nothing. The only reason your heart is still beating, the only reason you are pulling oxygen into your lungs, is because this wage slave decided you were worth the effort to drag into the dark." She slowly withdrew her hand and stepped back. "You are going to survive," Juliet said, her eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. "But you are going to lay there, in silence, and you are going to realize exactly who holds the power now. Blink twice if you understand." Damien lay frozen, the mechanical hiss of the ventilator the only sound in the room. His arrogant sneer was gone forever, replaced by the crushing weight of his own vulnerability. Slowly, agonizingly, as a single tear of sheer, frustrated helplessness escaped the corner of his eye, the terrifying Mafia boss blinked twice. Time lost all meaning in the subterranean tomb beneath the Hawthorne estate. There was no sun to mark the days, only the relentless artificial glare of the single bulb and the rhythmic, synthetic breathing of the ventilator keeping Damien Costa alive. For a man who had built an empire by manipulating the world around him, the total loss of autonomy was a psychological torture far worse than the agony radiating from his stapled abdomen. It was on what Juliet calculated to be the 3rd day that she finally decided his lungs were strong enough to function on their own. She stood over him, her expression an unreadable mask of clinical focus. Damien watched her every move, his dark eyes tracking her hands. He hated the fear he felt as she reached for the endotracheal tube. He was Damien Costa. He did not feel fear. Yet, as her gloved fingers gripped the plastic wedge down his throat, a primal panic flared in his chest. "Take a deep breath," Juliet commanded, a tone brooking no argument. "When I tell you to exhale, push the air out as hard as you can. It's going to burn, and you're going to gag. Do not fight me, or you'll tear your vocal cords." Damien nodded once, his jaw tight. "Breathe in," she ordered. He pulled a shallow, rattling breath into his chest, the stapled flesh of his abdomen screaming in protest. "Now, cough it out." Juliet pulled. The sensation was horrific, a scraping, suffocating slide of plastic tearing its way up his trachea. Damien gagged violently, his body seizing as she discarded the long, bloody tube onto a metal tray. He rolled onto his side, coughing up a mixture of bile and thick mucus, gasping greedily for the cold, stale air of the bunker. Every cough felt like a knife twisting into his organs. Juliet did not coddle him. She simply wiped his mouth with a damp cloth and adjusted his IV line. "Breathe through the pain," she instructed calmly. Your oxygen saturation is holding at 94%. You're breathing on your own. Damien fell back against the thin, sweat-soaked mattress, his chest heaving. It took several minutes for the black spots dancing in his vision to clear. When he finally found the strength to speak, his voice was a ruined, gravelly rasp, stripped of all its former terrifying bass. "Water," he croaked. Juliet picked up a plastic cup and a syringe. She didn't hand it to him. His arms were still too weak to lift it. Instead, she sat on the edge of the cot, leaning over him, and gently squeezed a few drops of lukewarm water onto his parched tongue. The intimacy of the act struck him like a physical blow. This woman, whom he had belittled and mocked as a wage slave just days prior, was now hand-feeding him. She held his life in a plastic syringe, yet she showed no arrogance, no triumph in his humiliation. She was merely executing a duty with an unyielding, terrifying grace. "Why?" Damien whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers as she withdrew the syringe. "Why what, Mr. Costa?" she asked, her voice neutral. "Why didn't you leave me?" He managed to say, the effort of stringing the words together exhausting him. Vinny bought the clinic. He bought my men. He would have paid you a fortune to let me die on that table. Why drag me down here?" Juliet paused, setting the water cup down on the rusted metal crate beside the cot. She looked at him, her gaze piercing through the dim yellow light. "Because I don't surrender my table," she said quietly. "Vincenzo Gallo doesn't dictate who lives and who dies in my trauma bay. I do. You are my patient. My responsibility, whether you are a saint or a monster, is entirely irrelevant to my scalpel." Damien stared at her, a strange, unfamiliar emotion warring with the physical pain in his chest. It was a profound, shocking respect. In his world, loyalty was a commodity, bought and sold with briefcases of cash. Everyone had a price, but Juliet Lawson operated on a completely different currency, a rigid, uncompromising moral absolute. She hadn't saved him out of love, or fear, or greed. She had saved him because it was her job, and she refused to be compromised. "You're crazy," Damien breathed, a weak, ironic smirk touching his cracked lips. "You saved a dead man, and buried yourself with him." "You aren't dead yet," Juliet replied, standing up and moving to check his surgical dressings. "But your fever is spiking. The temporary closure I did in the elevator was dirty. The staples are holding the tissue, but infection is setting in. The broad-spectrum antibiotics I grabbed from the crash cart are running out." Damien grimaced as she peeled back the dressing. The skin around the brutal, jagged line of stainless steel staples was angry, swollen, and radiating heat. "What happens now?" he asked, feeling the cold dread creeping back in. He was entirely dependent on her. If she failed, he died here in the dark. "I have to go up," Juliet stated matter-of-factly, walking over to a heavy metal locker in the corner of the bunker. "The Hawthorne Clinic has a secure pharmaceutical vault. I need to get inside, retrieve a heavy-course IV antibiotic, and find something to manage your pain before your nervous system goes into shock." She opened the locker and pulled out a heavy, matte black Glock 19. Damien's eyes widened slightly as she expertly checked the magazine, chambered around, and slipped it into a holster at her waist. The fluid, practiced motion betrayed a past she hadn't mentioned. "You know how to use that?" he asked, his voice strained. "I spent 2 tours in Kandahar pulling shrapnel out of Marines while taking mortar fire," Juliet replied, not looking at him as she zipped up a dark jacket. "I know how to handle myself." She walked back to his cot, placing a small dark object on the metal crate beside his head. It was a single unmarked capsule. "If I am not back in 4 hours," Juliet said, a voice devoid of any emotion, "it means Vincenzo's men caught me. They will eventually find this bunker. When they do, they won't kill you quickly. They will make an example of you. If you hear the heavy steel door at the top of the shaft open, and it isn't me, bite down on this. It's fast, and it's painless." Damien looked at the cyanide pill, then back to the woman who was willing to walk into a slaughterhouse for a man she despised. "Juliet," he rasped, using her first name for the first time. She paused at the heavy iron door of the bunker, looking back over her shoulder. "Don't miss," he whispered. The corner of her mouth twitched upward in the ghost of a smirk. "I never do." The ascent up the disposal shaft was a grueling exercise in silent agony. Juliet climbed the rusted maintenance ladder, her muscles burning as she navigated the pitch-black, narrow tunnel. 50 feet above, the Hawthorne estate was no longer a sanctuary. It was a war zone occupied by a hostile army. She pushed the heavy metal grate at the top of the shaft open just an inch, peering into the sub-basement morgue. It was empty, the backup generator humming softly in the distance. The air smelled strongly of bleach and the metallic copper tang of spilled blood. Vincenzo's men had been busy sanitizing their coup. Juliet slipped out of the shaft, moving with the silent, predatory grace she had learned in the desert. She kept her back to the wall, her hand resting naturally on the grip of the Glock at her hip. She bypassed the main elevators. They would be heavily monitored, and opted for the emergency stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time, making absolutely no sound. As she reached the second sublevel where the surgical suites and pharmaceutical vaults were located, she froze. Voices echoed down the sterile white hallway. "Tore the whole West Wing apart, boss." "Nothing," he vanished. Juliet pressed herself into the deep shadow of an alcove, holding her breath. "People don't just vanish, Dominic." Vincenzo Gallo's voice roared, echoing with a terrifying volatility. He had 3 bullets in his gut and a clamped aorta. He didn't get up and walk away. "The surgeon is dead in the stairwell, Dominic," one of Vinny's top enforcers replied nervously. "The nurse is missing. They must have taken the service tunnels. Maybe an ambulance was waiting. If he made it to a hospital, the police would be crawling all over this mountain by now." Vincenzo snarled, his heavy footsteps pacing the tile floor. "He's in this building. He has to be. That bitch nurse hid him. I want every floor, every closet, every crawl space ripped apart. Bring in the thermal scanners. If Damien Costa takes one more breath, I swear to God I will peel the skin off both of you." Juliet's heart hammered against her ribs. Thermal scanners. The fallout shelter was deep, insulated by thick concrete and lead lining designed to stop radiation, which would likely mask Damien's body heat. But if they brought dogs, or if they started breaking down walls, it was only a matter of time. She waited until the footsteps faded down the east corridor before making her move. She sprinted silently across the open hallway, swiping her master key card at the pharmaceutical vault. The red light blinked green and the heavy door clicked open. She moved fast, stuffing vials of broad-spectrum cephalosporins, bags of saline, and heavy vials of liquid morphine into her tactical backpack. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught something on the security desk near the door, a heavy, encrypted 2-way radio, left behind by one of the guards sweeping the floor. Without hesitating, she grabbed the radio, clipped it to her belt, and slipped back out into the hallway. The descent back to the bunker felt twice as long, her mind racing with the tactical reality of the situation. They were trapped in a box surrounded by heavily armed men hunting them, with a patient who couldn't walk. When she finally pushed through the heavy iron door of the fallout shelter, Damien's eyes snapped open. The relief that washed over his pale face was profound, stripping away the last remnants of the ruthless Mafia boss and leaving only a vulnerable, terrified man. He didn't look at the cyanide pill on the crate. He looked at her. "You're bleeding," he rasped, noticing a dark smear of red on her jacket. "Not my blood. Juliet said dismissively, dropping the backpack onto the floor and immediately preparing a syringe of antibiotics. She moved to his IV line, pushing the medication directly into his vein. Vinny is still here. He has the building locked down. They are bringing in thermal scanners to sweep the walls. Damien closed his eyes as the cool liquid of the morphine followed the antibiotics, dulling the searing agony in his gut. He knows I'm not dead. He knows I took you, Juliet corrected, pulling up a chair beside his bed. She unclipped the stolen radio and set it on the crate between them. They think we might have used the service tunnels, but he isn't taking chances. We have maybe 48 hours before they tear this foundation down to the bedrock. Damien stared at the black plastic of the radio. The heavy dose of painkillers was clearing the fever-induced fog in his brain, allowing the tactical, brilliant mind that had built a criminal empire to finally awaken. He looked at Juliet, really looking at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the absolute unwavering resilience radiating from her. "I need you to do something for me," Damien said, his voice stronger now, laced with a quiet, dangerous authority that made Juliet pause. "I'm not leaving this room again, Damien. It's suicide." "You don't have to leave," he replied, lifting his heavy, shaking hand to point at the radio. "Vinny is arrogant. He thinks he won. But he doesn't know about the fail-safes I built into my own organization. He thinks loyalty is bought with money. I bought it with secrets." Juliet frowned, leaning closer. "What are you talking about?" "There is a man," Damien whispered, his eyes burning with a dark, vengeful fire. "A cleaner. He doesn't work for the family. He works exclusively for me. He owes me a debt that money can't repay. If we can tap that radio into the clinic's encrypted outward frequency, I can give you a sequence to broadcast. It's a blind drop signal, and if this cleaner receives it..." Juliet asked, skeptical. "He will come," Damien said with absolute certainty. "He will bring a tactical extraction team that will make Vinny's men look like amateurs. But we have to splice that radio into the old hardline comms wiring of this bunker to boost the signal through the concrete." Juliet looked up at the crumbling ceiling, tracing the ancient exposed electrical conduits running along the concrete beams. She was a combat medic. She knew basic field communications. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble in the dark. If we boost a signal, Vinny's men might intercept the transmission spike, Juliet warned, looking back down at him. "It could lead them straight to this room. If we do nothing, they find us anyway," Damien countered, his hand reaching out to weakly grasp her wrist. His touch was cold, but his grip was firm. "You saved my life, Juliet. You brought me back from the dark. Let me get us out of here." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the ceiling and the heavy, measured breaths of the man on the bed. The dynamic had shifted again. He was no longer just the patient, and she was no longer just the nurse. They were partners, tethered together in the dark, preparing to wage war against the men walking above them. "Tell me the frequency," Juliet said, standing up and pulling a heavy combat knife from her boot to strip the wires. Just as she reached for the conduit, a sound echoed through the bunker. It wasn't the hum of the generator or the dripping water. It was a heavy metallic thud, vibrating directly through the concrete ceiling above their heads. Thud, thud, thud. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and directly over the hidden trapdoor of the disposal shaft. Damien's grip tightened on the edge of his cot. Juliet froze, her knife suspended in the air, her eyes locked on the ceiling. The hunt was over. The wolves had found the door. Dust drifted down from the cracked concrete ceiling like dirty snow, settling on the sterile packaging of the medical supplies. The heavy metallic thuds above them stopped, replaced by a far more terrifying sound, the harsh, grinding screech of heavy machinery dragging across the floorboards. They had found the hidden entrance to the disposal shaft. "They're moving the morgue freezers," Juliet whispered, her voice tight but entirely steady. She didn't look up again. Instead, her hands moved in a blur of desperate precision. She sliced through the thick rubber casing of the bunker's ancient communication lines with her combat knife, exposing the copper wires beneath. "Give me the frequency," she demanded, grabbing the stolen two-way radio and popping the back panel off to expose its motherboard. Damien's chest heaved, his stapled abdomen burning with a white-hot agony as he forced himself to sit up slightly against the rusted headboard. The morphine was working, blunting the sharpest edges of the pain, but the sheer physical exertion of remaining conscious was draining his reserves rapidly. "Frequency 49.27, Damien rasped, his dark eyes locked onto her swift movements. "Encrypted channel, the passcode is Archangel. Tell them the king is in the crypt. They'll know exactly what it means." Juliet twisted the copper wires together, a shower of tiny blue sparks erupting into the dim air as the analog hardline of the fallout shelter bridged with the modern digital radio. She pressed the heavy transmission button on the side of the radio. Static hissed violently through the small speaker, echoing loudly in the cramped bunker. "This is a blind drop for Archangel." Juliet spoke clearly into the receiver, her eyes flicking toward the heavy iron door of the shelter. "The king is in the crypt. I repeat, the king is in the crypt." Immediate extraction required at the Hawthorne Estate sublevel. She released the button. There was no confirmation, no voice on the other end telling them help was on the way. Just the cold, indifferent hiss of dead air. High above them, a muffled shout echoed down the concrete shaft. It was followed by the distinct, unmistakable roar of an acetylene blowtorch igniting. A faint orange glow began to reflect off the damp walls of the shaft leading down to their door. They were cutting the hinges off the heavy iron grate. "They're coming down," Juliet stated, tossing the radio onto the cot beside Damien's leg. She grabbed a heavy metal crate that held their meager water supply and shoved it hard across the floor, wedging it tightly beneath the handle of the bunker's iron door. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would buy seconds. She drew the Glock 19 from her holster, checking the chamber one last time. "Damien, I need you to lie completely flat. When the door opens, they are going to throw a flashbang or spray the room blindly. If you sit up, you catch a stray bullet." Damien looked at her, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. He was the boss of the largest syndicate on the coast. He was a man who commanded legions of heavily armed soldiers, a man who broke kneecaps and ended lives with a flick of his wrist. And yet here he lay, completely useless, entirely dependent on a woman he had viciously insulted while bleeding out on her table. As he watched Juliet take up a tactical firing position behind a rusted metal support pillar, her weapon raised and her eyes locked on the door, a profound realization washed over him. He had spent his entire life accumulating wealth and terrifying men into submission, convinced that cruelty equated to strength. He had mocked Juliet, calling her a glorified maid because she served others. But true power wasn't a gun or a bank account. True power was the unwavering courage to stand in the dark, outgunned and outmanned, and hold the line for someone else. She was the most terrifying, magnificent creature he had ever seen. The arrogance that had defined his existence shattered entirely, replaced by a fierce, suffocating terror that he was going to watch this incredible woman die because of his mistakes. "Juliet, don't play hero," Damien ordered, his voice raw and pleading. "If they breach, surrender. Tell Vinny I forced you at gunpoint. He'll let you live." Juliet didn't look back at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the heavy iron door. "I told you, Mr. Costa, I don't lose patience on my table. And I don't negotiate with traitors." A massive, deafening explosion rocked the bunker. Dust and debris rained down as a shaped breaching charge blew the heavy iron door entirely off its massive hinges. The thick slab of metal slammed into the crate Juliet had wedged against it, buckling inward with a horrific screech. Before the smoke could even clear, the blinding white beam of a tactical flashlight cut through the darkness, attached to the barrel of an automatic rifle. "Clear the room," a voice yelled. Juliet didn't hesitate. She stepped out from behind the pillar and fired 3 rapid, deafening shots into the smoke. A man screamed Dominic, and the blinding flashlight dipped wildly toward the floor as a heavy body hit the concrete. Automatic gunfire answered her instantly. The deafening roar of a suppressed submachine gun filled the tiny room, bullets sparking wildly off the concrete walls and tearing through the rusted metal of Damien's cot. Juliet dove back behind the pillar as pieces of shattered concrete rained down on her. "Ceasefire! Ceasefire, you idiots! Don't hit the boss!" Vincenzo Gatto's voice roared from the hallway. The gunfire stopped abruptly, leaving only the ringing in their ears and the thick, choking smell of cordite. Footsteps crunched over the shattered door. Vincenzo stepped into the dim, jaundiced light of the fallout shelter. He held a heavy revolver in his right hand, his bespoke suit covered in plaster dust, his face twisted into an ugly, triumphant sneer. 2 heavily armed enforcers flanked him, their weapons trained on the pillar where Juliet was hiding. "Well, well, well," Vincenzo mocked, stepping over Dominic's groaning body and approaching the cot. He looked down at Damien, a cruel laugh escaping his lips. "Look at the great Damien Costa, strapped to a rusty bed in a basement, hiding behind a nurse's skirt. You're pathetic." Damien stared up at his former friend, his dark eyes burning with an absolute freezing hatred. "You're a dead man, Vinny. You just don't know it yet." "Is that right?" Vincenzo chuckled, raising the revolver and pointing it directly at Damien's head. "Because from where I'm standing, I own your empire, I own your territory, and in about 3 seconds, I'm going to own your life." He turned his head slightly toward the pillar. "Come out, little bird. Drop the gun, or I put a bullet between his eyes right now." Juliet closed her eyes, taking a deep, slow breath. She looked at her empty magazine, then tossed the useless Glock onto the floor. She stepped out from behind the pillar, her hands raised, her face a mask of cold defiance. "Ah, the miracle worker," Vincenzo sneered, looking her up and down. "You cost me a lot of time and money, sweetheart. You should have just let him bleed." Vincenzo shifted his aim, leveling the heavy barrel of the revolver directly at Juliet's chest. "Ladies first." "No!" Damien roared, ignoring the agonizing, tearing pain in his sutured abdomen. Damien threw his entire body weight sideways off the cot. He crashed heavily into Vincenzo's legs just as the traitor pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening. The bullet sparked off the concrete wall inches from Juliet's head, showering her with stone shrapnel. Vincenzo cursed, stumbling backward from Damien's desperate tackle, raising the gun to shoot his former boss in the back. But before Vincenzo could pull the trigger again, the lights in the bunker flickered and died completely. Total, suffocating darkness swallowed the room. Panic instantly erupted from Vincenzo's men. Where did the lights go? Turn on the flashlights. Before a single beam could cut through the black, the distinct, terrifying sound of heavy tactical boots dropping down the disposal shaft echoed into the bunker. It wasn't the clumsy descent of Mafia thugs, it was the synchronized, silent drop of professional operators. Suddenly the room was illuminated by the eerie green glow of night vision lasers cutting through the dust. Suppressed gunfire erupted in a series of precise 3-round bursts. It lasted less than 4 seconds. The 2 enforcers flanking Vincenzo hit the floor simultaneously, their weapons clattering uselessly against the concrete. Vincenzo screamed, a wet, choking sound as a heavy combat boot kicked the revolver out of his hand, followed by the sickening crunch of a rifle butt smashing into his jaw. "Room secure, target neutralized," a deep synthesized voice commanded. Emergency tactical lights flared to life, blindingly bright, flooding the small bunker. Standing over Vincenzo's unconscious, bleeding body were 4 men dressed in pitch-black tactical gear, their faces obscured by heavily armored gas masks and quad-lens night vision goggles. The leader, a massive man with the call sign Archangel stitched into his vest, stepped forward. He looked down at Damien, who was sprawled on the concrete floor, clutching his bleeding abdomen, and then over to Juliet, who was already rushing to Damien's side. "Sorry we're late, boss," Archangel said, his voice a low gravel. "Traffic on the interstate was a nightmare. Let's get you out of this tomb." Rand. 3 weeks later. The ocean breeze blew softly through the open balcony doors of the secluded, high-security penthouse in Miami. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore was a stark, peaceful contrast to the chaotic violence of the Hawthorne estate. Damien Costa stood by the glass railing, leaning heavily on an expensive mahogany cane. The surgical staples were gone, replaced by a neat, healing scar, but the internal recovery was slow. He wore a loose linen shirt, the dark circles under his eyes fading, his strength returning day by day. Behind him, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse opened. Juliet walked in, carrying a small leather duffel bag. She wore a simple white sundress, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, looking entirely different from the blood-soaked combat nurse in the bunker. She set the bag down by the door. "Your vitals are completely stable, Damien. The infection is gone, and the tissue is healing perfectly. You don't need a full-time trauma nurse anymore. Archangel's medical team can handle the routine checkups." Damien turned around slowly, his knuckles white as he gripped the cane. The thought of her leaving sent a sharp, unfamiliar ache through his chest, a pain far worse than the bullets had ever caused. "I don't want Archangel's team," Damien said, his voice soft, stripped of all its former aggressive command. "My job here is done," Juliet replied, forcing a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She walked over to the mahogany desk, setting down his final medical chart. "You survived. You got your empire back. Vincenzo is rotting in a black site and your syndicates are in line. You don't need me." Damien closed the distance between them, his limp noticeable but his gaze entirely steady. He stopped just inches from her, looking down into the eyes of the woman who had dragged him out of hell. "When I was on that table," Damien began, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with shame, "I called you a glorified maid. I told you that you were a wage slave cleaning up messes for the men who run the world." Juliet looked up at him, her expression guarded. "I remember." Damien reached out, his warm, strong hand gently cupping the side of her face. His thumb lightly brushed across her cheekbone, exactly where the stone shrapnel had grazed her in the bunker. "I was a fool," Damien confessed, his dark eyes entirely vulnerable, baring his soul to her. "I thought I knew what power was. I thought I held the world in my hands because men feared me. But when the lights went out, and my money meant absolutely nothing, you were the one who held my life. You faced down armed men to protect a man who had treated you like dirt." He stepped closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever met, Juliet. You didn't just save my life down there in the dark. You completely unmade me. You shattered the man I was." Juliet's breath hitched slightly, the professional walls she had built around her heart trembling under the sheer sincerity in his voice. "Damien, don't leave," he pleaded, dropping the cane so he could hold her face with both hands. "I don't want you as my nurse. I don't want to pay you to stay. I am asking you as a man who owes you his every breath. Stay with me. Rule this world with me. Because I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to stand in the dark alone again." Juliet stared into his eyes, seeing the absolute truth burning within them. The ruthless mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man fiercely, irrevocably in love. Slowly, the guarded tension melted from her shoulders. She reached up, her hands resting over his, and let a genuine, radiant smile break across her face. "You're going to be a terrible patient," she whispered, stepping up onto her tiptoes. "The worst," Damien agreed, just before he leaned down and captured her lips with his, sealing a promise born in blood, forged in the dark, and bound by a love that no bullet could ever touch. Did you love this thrilling journey of redemption, danger, and undeniable romance? When a ruthless mafia king collides with a fearless trauma nurse, sparks and bullets are bound to fly. If you want to dive into more gripping, high-stakes audio stories filled with shocking twists, fierce heroines, and dangerously handsome mob bosses, smash that like button right now. Share this intense story with your friends who love a good enemies to lovers romance. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on the next heart-pounding chapter. See you next time.